So I've recently started rewatching Arrow Season 1, and every time I finish a season, like I did with The Flash, I'm going to be ranking every episode of the season, and after I do all 7 seasons, I'll be doing the top 10 episodes and the top 10 worst episodes again, like I did with The Flash. In this video, I'll be doing short reviews for each episode of Season 1, also at the same time ranking them from worst to best, and at the end of each review, you'll see the score I give that episode. I will say that for Season 1, considering how long ago it came out, or like at the time it came out, the trailers for Season 1, not all of them are in good quality. I couldn't really find a good quality of every single trailer. Not a lot of them are bad quality, but some of them are, so just keep that in mind while watching the video. With that in mind, let's start with number 23, and the worst episode of the season, which is actually pretty good.
I'm a killer.
This is the only episode of the season that I don't think is good. I mean, it's not bad at all, it's okay, but I don't think it's good, and the reason for that is because it's a pretty filler episode, except for like the flashbacks, which are actually pretty good. This episode doesn't really contribute much to the storyline of the season, not to mention that Firefly is kind of a waste of a villain, as he's used as a one-off villain, and even without that, he's not exactly very good. So this episode, while not bad at all, and actually almost decent, or almost good actually, it's the only episode of the season that is lower than 8 out of 10.
He's armed. He's extremely dangerous, and if you see him, shoot to kill.
Episode 2 was an episode that I felt like there was just more setting up than anything. Like, obviously they had to get to a point where a lot of interesting things that will happen. Like, in the flashbacks in this episode, not really very much happened because they were setting up all the flashbacks in the season, and I felt like that was kind of the case for the entirety of the episode, which is why this episode is fairly low on the list, and yet it is not a bad episode at all. In fact, it is pretty good.
Guys,
I think I have a problem.
stay calm. If I find him, I can get him to disarm it.
This episode definitely has a lot of great things going for it, like the introduction of Roy Harper, that's definitely pretty awesome, the flashbacks, which are pretty good, and the storyline with Moira, which is also pretty great in this episode. But the reason it's going to be lower on the list, even though it's actually pretty good, I mean, most of the season is pretty good, and a lot of them are very close in quality, but this episode is slightly worse, as I don't really think Dodger was an amazing villain. He wasn't bad at all, but he wasn't exactly great, so this episode is lower on the list, despite, again, being
I can't kill her.
It's not gonna work out between you two. I don't take prisoners.
Now, upon a rewatch of the season, I didn't really like the Huntress as much as I thought I did. I mean, she's not bad at all, but her episodes are not exactly the best of the season. And while none of them are bad necessarily, and some of them are going to be fairly high on the list, I think the Huntress return especially is not exactly amazing or anything. I think that the flashbacks in this episode are pretty great, and there's definitely a lot of great things going for it, but it's still, even though it's pretty good, it's going to be fairly low on the list.
You want?
I want your help. It's time for the 10:15 to Bloodhaven.
You need me back!
It feels like justice.
This episode was a pretty good one. Again, pretty low on the list just because it's just a little bit worse than most episodes in the season, but it is still pretty good, as in this episode, Diggle joined Team Arrow, which I thought was not only a very good storyline, but also just the fact that Diggle finally joined the team. I mean, not really finally, it's only episode 4, but the fact that he did in this episode definitely gives this episode some points, and the actual main storyline with the innocent man that the title is talking about is a very feel-good storyline by the end that I think works for the episode.
After there, so this is gonna blow up into an all-out mob war.
There will be blood.
Be careful with my father.
You are doused with gasoline playing with matches.
This episode I thought was certainly better than the episode we would get later. This two-parter as a whole was definitely a lot better. While I thought this was a great introduction to Helen Bertinelli, who would later become the Huntress, and that storyline in this episode was pretty good. This episode does focus a lot on romance, which normally would be a problem. Like, that definitely would make for a worse episode. That is in basically every season outside of Arrow Season 1, as I really kind of liked the romantic subplots in this season, probably more than any other season in the Arrowverse. So because of that, this episode is legitimately pretty good.
Crime happens in this city every day.
Everybody move!
When people are in trouble, they tend to make the wrong choices.
How poetic.
Now, the Royal Flush Gang are not exactly good villains. Also, they're kind of a waste of the comic book group, the Royal Flush Gang. They could have maybe been interesting, superpowered villains down the road in the Arrowverse, but I think that everything surrounding the Royal Flush Gang are really good, like the legacies that the title is suggesting, which has to do with Robert Queen, which also ties into the flashbacks. So I thought the flashbacks in this episode were really, really good. So all in all, Legacies is a very good episode.
I will kill you and your family.
I admire your work.
It's kind of weird to me that Lone Gunman is only number 16 out of 23 on this list, because I really like this episode. I mean, just an episode that I like as much as this one, that it's this low on the list. It really shows how consistent the season is with the quality of its episodes, as most of them are pretty similar, like, you know, in between 8 to 9 out of 10. But this episode's right there in the middle, as I think Deadshot is a great villain, and this episode overall is a pretty good episode.
Deadly intervention.
Stop playing games.
You are me of this city!
I should have killed you when I had the chance.
This episode is definitely pretty good, with the return of the Count, even though he definitely doesn't really play much of a role in terms of being the villain of this episode. Just his presence and what he does to Oliver, his rivalry with Oliver, which I thought was really great in this season. It definitely enhances this episode, and it definitely enhances other episodes in the season as well. But I thought that storyline was pretty good. The storyline with Quentin, Tommy, and Laurel was pretty good, and the flashbacks, which is really the case for the entirety of the season, were pretty great as well.
He's never gonna find out my secret.
You saved my life.
So let's find him.
This episode is kind of a weird one, as the main storyline with Oliver and Laurel and Tommy, as well as this new villain, Mr. Blank, and this one-off villain, Mr. Blank, who is supposed to be based off Onomatopoeia, is kind of filler. It's really just the flashbacks and the storyline with Diggle that isn't filler, and even though that's the case, it is still very enjoyable. Like, the main storyline with the quote-unquote home invasion is definitely a very good one, not to mention Deadshot is great in this episode, and the conflict between Oliver and Diggle, I thought was a conflict that was handled very well. Also, the fight scenes in this episode are very good.
One bullet left. Shoot me.
Take your revenge. Or you can shoot yourself. It's your choice.
So like I said, the Count is a very, very good villain who is probably the best recurring villain in the season. It's really between him and Deadshot as to who's better, but the Count does have, I think, a better rivalry with the main character. Deadshot has a rivalry with Diggle, but the Count has a great rivalry with Oliver Queen, and I thought that really enhanced this episode, not to mention that the flashbacks are pretty good, and I like how they connect it to the present day, where Oliver kind of learned how to do that thing where he kind of shut off that guy, made him seem like he was dead. Also, the introduction to the Bratva in this episode, and that obviously teases what's to come in a very long time in Season 5. So all that I thought was very good, making for a great episode.
Everyone deserves a chance to prove it that he's innocent.
Every name on that list has a reason to be there.
Put the bow down.
The storylines in this episode are all really good. The storyline with Oliver and Diggle is very well handled. I really like that one. The flashbacks in this episode are particularly good, and the storylines with Malcolm Merlyn, just like in most of the episodes, especially episodes after episode 9 in this season, that was all really, really good. And honestly, don't really know what else to say about this episode. It's just a really good episode, similarly to basically every other episode in the season.
This feels good, and not just the justice part.
This was, I thought, certainly the best Huntress episode, and while the storyline with Huntress isn't really that much better than the other storylines, I mean, it's definitely, I think, better, and seeing the Arrow or the Hood at the time and the Huntress teaming up in this episode was great, but I think it's the rest of the episode that makes it as good as it is. I mean, Walter's storyline, where he's investigating the list and the book that was given to him, I think that was really interesting, and although this episode doesn't have flashbacks, which in this season is a shame, it still is, I think, a great episode.
Nobody can know my secret.
Arrow did not get to a rocky start, as the first episode ever is a very, very good one. This episode has some pretty awesome fight scenes, it has a great storyline throughout, and it does a great job of introducing us to Oliver Queen, Starling City, and the storyline that we will be seeing in the show. Now, while I do think the episode maybe drags on a little bit, maybe it just feels a little slow at times, that's really the only problem with the episode, as other than that, it's practically perfect.
Put him down. I think I just found the biggest guy.
He's a murderer.
We're not alone.
Annihilate him.
Now, I will say that I really dislike the villain of this episode, Cyrus Vance. He's so irritating, he's so annoying. Maybe the worst villain that the show has ever seen, or at least, you know, the worst villain in a good season, as this episode just has a terrible villain. But somehow, someway, that does not ruin the episode for me at all, as this episode is pretty damn awesome, as we see Diggle investigating Moira and how that leads up to the ending when Oliver, as the Hood, actually confronts Moira in one of the best moments of the show ever, and maybe the second best ending to any episode. It's just such an epic moment, not to mention that the flashbacks in this episode are pretty great as well.
You're out of time!
Why should I trust you? We all gotta die sometime.
This episode is really, really good. The flashbacks, like the rest of the season, are great, but it's definitely the present-day storyline that makes this episode as good as it is. The fact that Deadshot returns in this episode is obviously great, and the storyline with Moira trying to assassinate Malcolm, going behind his back, kind of like with like a political thriller feel to it. I really like that aspect of this season, but again, all of those things are great, but it's really the fact that Malcolm Merlyn is involved in this episode, also his relationship with Tommy and how they handle that really, really elevates the episode, and the fact that Oliver reveals his identity to Tommy and the way they handled that, I just think that all of that happening in this episode made it one of the better episodes of the season.
You can see it or not.
I need to know.
By accusing my son, you made him a target.
This episode is a really good one, as it shows Oliver being arrested and suspect for being the Hood or the Vigilante, which is definitely a storyline that I thought was a really, really smart thing to do at the beginning of the season, and they really handled it very well. I think this episode is very well acted. It's also very well written. The flashbacks are pretty great. It's just a great episode through and through, which is kind of rare for near the beginning of this season, as most of the episodes aren't exactly the best of the season. Well, this one is one of them.
They don't show my restraint.
Kick his.
I find you guilty. No one's gonna miss me. And I sentence you to death.
Salvation is an episode that I really, really like. Like, again, one of the best episodes of the season. It goes without saying, the flashbacks in this episode are great, but the storyline, I think, with the Lances is legitimately a little bit emotional, and the storyline with Moira, like I said, I really like that aspect of the season, and it worked well in this episode, just like it did in most of the episodes that had the type of storyline. And obviously, the main storyline of the season is legitimately pretty good. I think it's very well acted. I really like how they use music for some reason in the storyline, especially the moment where Oliver saves Roy, not to mention that with Roy Harper, I really like how this episode used him and how it set him up as a character who idolizes the Vigilante and obviously would later become Arsenal and a superhero in his own right.
Kill one hostage every hour till he surrenders himself to my authority. Help me.
The first ever mid-season finale was certainly not the best mid-season finale of the Arrowverse ever, but it definitely was a hell of a good start for the concept of mid-season finales in this show, as The Year's End just does such a great job at, first of all, showing our first showdown between the Hood and the Dark Archer, between Oliver Queen and a character who would later be known as Malcolm Merlyn. Actually, that was revealed in this very episode, so again, that was a very good reveal. Not to mention, like, it doesn't really have to be mentioned, but the flashbacks in this episode are really good as well, and the ending is maybe one of the best endings of the season. I just really, really like the ending where Oliver says he's gonna catch the author of the real author of the list, and then it zooms out with the music in the background. I really like it a lot, and one of the, I think, 3 best endings of this season. But anyway, this episode was definitely good enough to make it into the top 5.
Survival is not a birthright.
It's a privilege.
What's happening?
He's coding. His heart stopped. Clear.
This episode was the first of many flashback episodes that have present-day storylines but more focus or have more screen time to the flashbacks. And while I don't think this is the best episode that entirely focuses around flashbacks, the season 2 and 5 definitely had some pretty awesome episodes in that regard. Obviously, I'll get to that in other videos, but this is still a very good episode in its own right, as Oliver and Slade try to get a ride home from Edward Fires' plane. That just, I think it works so well, and not even that, but also the present-day storyline with Diggle and Felicity trying to get Oliver back from kind of the dead after Moira shot him at the beginning of the episode. I just think it all is so good, making for a great episode and one of the best of the season.
Feels really good having you inside my ear.
Stay focused, please.
You're gonna be really upset when you meet my partner.
I heard you never miss.
I don't.
Other than maybe like the season-long storylines and even the flashbacks, I think this season's biggest strength is the ending, as the final couple episodes are just so damn good, and the way they build up from one episode to the next one is just perfect. So first of all, episode 21, titled The Undertaking, is such a great episode, with the flashbacks focusing around Malcolm Merlin coming up with a plan to decimate or destroy the Glades, Robert not really liking that, and then Malcolm killing Robert on the boat, also leading up to Oliver going with Robert on the boat and deciding to cheat on Laurel. I thought all of that was handled really, really well. Also, the present-day storyline with Malcolm and Moira, it's really cool, but not to mention the storyline with Oliver actually freeing Walter. Not only are there some great fight scenes that are really like some of the best fight scenes of the season, but also the moment where Oliver actually saves Walter is so satisfying. It's such an awesome moment, making this episode certainly one of the best of the season, and one of the first of 3 great, incredible episodes that ended this season.
What are you doing here?
Helping your father with an investigation.
I need you to stop.
I need to know.
I'm finally seeing you for who you really are.
The penultimate episode of the season is a really good one. The beginning with Oliver trying to figure out what Moira knows, using Diggle as the hood to do that. That was awesome. The sequence of events where Oliver and the rest of Team Arrow try to infiltrate Merlin Global, I thought that was really cool. Obviously, the fact that Laurel and Oliver got together in this episode, which never really went anywhere the rest of the show, I think it really should have. I think naturally it should have. It's just that maybe the fan base of the CW, that's not what they wanted. Anyway, I thought that was a really good moment in this episode, and it worked really well also to more fuel Tommy's hatred in this episode. But the ending of the episode where Oliver goes up against Merlin and also learns that he is the Dark Archer, it's so awesome, and it's such a great penultimate episode for this season.
It's some kind of a hero.
Are you ready to die?
Now, as good as this season was, I think that the actual finale was so much better than the rest of the season, it's insane. Like, they stuck the landing in a way that exceeded any expectations I ever had. This episode is practically perfect, and I really can't even think of a single problem with the episode. The beginning where Merlin learns Oliver's identity is a great way to start the episode, but then there's like so many great moments after that. The They Deserve to Die moment was one of the best acted moments of the entire show. It's amazing, and it really showcases Merlin's motivation in a way that the rest of the season just didn't. I mean, it did, but this episode expanded upon that in such a great way. And then the fight at the end between Oliver and Merlin is a really good final showdown between the main hero and the main villain. And something that really unexpected happens is that Merlin had a second device that Quentin wasn't able to stop, or Quentin and Felicity were not able to stop. So that goes off, which is extremely unexpected. And there are a lot of great moments there between Roy and Thea, but it's really Tommy's death that I think just brings this whole thing together. I mean, after all these awesome moments, great fight scenes, great acting from especially John Barrowman, and a lot of great moments with, I think, some amazing music in the background, and also some surprising moments. I think Tommy's death brings it all together in such a great way, as this death is legitimately the most emotional and the saddest death that the Arrowverse has ever given us. Even though it is the first big death that the Arrowverse has ever had, it is still the best one, as it still makes me tear up basically every single time I watch it. It's incredibly emotional. Not above all that, but with all that, the flashbacks in this episode are amazing. So that is my ranking for every episode of Arrow Season 1. Let me know what your ranking is in the comments down below. But if you can't do that, then at least what is your favorite episode and maybe your least favorite episode of this season. If you haven't seen my videos ranking every episode of The Flash Seasons 1 through 5, as well as the top 10 best and worst episodes of that show, definitely check all those videos out. You can check that out. It's all going to be on my front page or in my videos section on my channel. And stay tuned as I will do the same thing for Arrow in addition to doing Season 6 and 7. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.